Hello, I'm Alex. This is day 27 of the 30-day challenge where I'm learning to speak better English, build my camera confidence as well as my mouth connection. Alright, so I just finished reading this book, Trip War by Chris Miller. It's a pretty thick book, and I started reading it in late July and just finished it a couple of days ago. Took me 4 months, but I finally finished it. And I thought I will share a little bit of what I learned and some of my thoughts on it. So, like World War II was fought over like raw materials like oil, steels, and other materials that made out of tanks, planes, and warships and all that. So, according to Chris Miller, the next resource that is being fought over, like the new oil, is chips. Like not French fries kind of chips, but uh, semiconductors, computer chips. Like little tiny pieces of computing microprocessors that is available in mobile phones, iPad, computers, and basically everything digital, even microwaves or refrigerators, cars, pretty much, everything that is connected to a power source is sort of contains some kind of chips. Now, the book did a pretty good job of describing how the history of how a chip come to be. It was developed in the late 1940s, I think. And it was, like really big computer back then. If you have watched the movie The Imitation Game, where Benedict Cumberbatch was the leading actor in that, so it was something like what is described in the movie, where a computer was the size of the room. But anyway, chips and computer was originally born out of U.S. military projects and eventually become more of consumer facing than military. So the book basically went on to cover a lot of the early companies and key figures who were critical to the development of chips, like Gordon Morse, who is best known for the Morse law, and Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, who were the founder of Intel, and other key figures like Morris Chen, the founder of TSMC. So basically, like, United States has always been known for pushing the cutting edge, the advancement of different technologies. So these people, they, with the help of the US government, start to make computer chips that powers, in the early days of missiles, and also later on like personal computers. Now, just like how movies and TV shows described that innovation, eventually leads to capitalism. So that pushes the idea of driving down cost. And to drive down cost, you basically need to build factories in other countries where the labor is a lot cheaper than America. So that basically gives rise to other countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and a few other European and Southeast Asian countries. But America is still lead as a leader in innovation. So even though production is outsourced overseas, a lot of the design work is still kept in America. So fast forward to today, right? The entire supply chain is very interdependent. Like countries depend on each other in order to produce computer chips. Like Japan makes the chemicals that made out of like the computer chips, and then the United States, they are designing the software that produce the chips. They are designing the chip itself, and then that goes to Taiwan and South Korea. Like South Korea, they make the memory chips, and like HK Hynix and Samsung, these two players, they are the major players in making the memory chips. And Taiwan TSMC, obviously, they produce the advanced chips like the 5 nanometers or below chips, like chips that goes into the most advanced devices like the new iPhone. And then there's Netherlands, where they have a company called ASML. Basically, what they do is they produce a machine called they produce the EUV lithography machines. So basically, that machine goes into factories or fabs that produces the chips like TSMC, Samsung, or HK Hynix. And without the machine, it is impossible for those big factories to basically have a production line to create chips. EUV lithography machines basically like they use light to carve this pattern on a piece of very small metal. So if I remember correctly, each of that lithography machines costs like $150 million or something like that, and it has thousands of moving parts in order to just produce that single machine. Anyway, the entire supply chain looks something like Japan. They produce chemicals, raw materials, alongside like China and Russia. They produce the raw material that made up of a chip, and then the United States they basically design the chips, and that design goes into fabrication fabs or production like factories, like chip factories. That's called a fab. Basically, that goes into a fab to Taiwan or like TSMC, or Korea like HK Hynix and Samsung. And then Netherlands they produce EUV lithography machines that allow TSMC to actually build a factories that make chips. I hope that makes sense. So basically, like China and US, they haven't always been on the friendliest of terms, and basically they are fighting for control of chips. Because all these supply chains, the key players in the supply chains, are sort of friendly to America and China. They are the biggest buyers of chips, but they don't hold a significant advantage or significant position in the entire supply chain. And so, China is now trying to design and produce their own chips so that they don't have to rely on external suppliers. Like, it is definitely a very interesting read. Like, it is sort of like a history lesson or geopolitical thriller. Like, every chapter is really short. It's like less than 10 pages, but like in a way it is very focused on the American angle. But I guess it is written by American writers, so that makes sense. But it is very fixated on the tension between American, China, and Taiwan is sort of caught in the middle. And then there's also Japan and Korea, who is sort of on the sideline but also caught in the middle of things. Basically it's like the movie Godzilla, right? So like Godzilla is fighting Kong and everybody else is just sort of caught in between. And that sort of the book sort of explain what happened in the past that leads up to this trade war thing. Like, as a Taiwanese, right, it is also very interesting to see why TSMC is basically called, in Chinese they call it 护国神山, which the literal translation is the sacred mountain that protects the country. But a better localization is the silicon shell. Basically, TSMC produced like 90% of the world's advanced chips, and that is one of the, if not the only reason that China has not invaded Taiwan. And I see that on the news every single day, but I never truly learned the history of TSMC. And in this book, it sort of gave me that history lesson. Oh, and one interesting thing I learned is that, oh, I always thought Silicon Valley is a home of innovation. It is mostly software because all I see is a lot of unicorn business, software business based in Silicon Valley. It's like Meta or Snapchat, Instagram, and everything. And apparently that is not the case. Like the reason it is called the Silicon Valley is because it was the original funding area of chips. So like a lot Intel and a lot of chip design and manufacturing company in the past were based in Silicon Valley. That's where it got its name. And as production, factories moved overseas, what's left is mostly the design firms. And I guess that is why I always thought Silicon Valley is mostly software, because it is design and it is a ground of a lot of technological innovations. Yeah, like it is definitely a pretty thick book, but every chapter is short and interesting and gave a lot of history lessons and perspective on why the U.S. Trump administration is trying to start this trade war or imposing tariffs on China and other countries. One thing I don't really agree with about the book is that in the book it basically described TSMC as the choke point of the entire supply chain because it produced like 90% of the advanced chips. But from my understanding is that the choke point, the most critical choke point is actually Netherlands, ASML, because TSMC produced 90% of the advanced chips, but there are still 10% left that is produced by Samsung and other companies. And the chips, the non-advanced chips, or what do you call it, like more normal chips, like 5 nanometers and above, like chips that go into a fridge or microwave, they are not usually or at all produced by TSMC. But no chips can be produced without the EUV lithography machines. And there's only one company in the world that make that, which is ASML of Netherlands. So I guess that is one of the reasons that I think the book is a little bit biased, because they try to pump up the tension between US and China so much that ASML is not really given a lot of consideration in the book, or maybe it's just that Netherlands has always been more neutral in terms of political stance and more US friendly, and they are based in Europe. I don't know, like maybe a little bit of both. Anyway, that is my take on reading the book Chip War by Chris Miller. And so yeah, that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.